overdose, now you have heart problems, now you're eligible. So we wait till people are sick before we actually provide them help. And so there's so much we can be doing when it comes to prevention with children and schools, and supporting families who parents that struggle with drug addiction, like harm reduction model, let's say in certain Inuit communities in Nunavik and Nunavut, is they work with mothers, like let's say may have addiction issues, where when they want to go, like let's say drink or use drugs, instead of removing the children, is that they provide care in the home. So we're not creating more trauma and intergenerational trauma of taking children away from their mothers and their families. These are models that actually do work, and they just are very far and few between. Like there's nothing in Montreal, like for example, when we talk about I've worked for a long time in violence against women, and I never understood why we have women and their children, like at the name they need to leave their partners to come to us, and why are we having the partners go to a shelter and do treatment, and the women stay at home with their children, and I'm not saying that also men can be victims, but in the majority of the cases that I've worked with. So it's really, and then also getting to the root causes of what is like when we talk about intimate partner violence, it's so present in so many different communities, but it's so stigmatized, right? And when I talk to a violent man, I've worked with many very violent men. I worked at a shelter, and I used to work men's shelter, and it was men who had just were just coming out of prison, and some of them were sex offenders, and had abused their children, sexually abused their children, and the conditions the conditions that they had to find employment and housing, pretty much is we're creating that they're going to reoffend. It's so stressful, and we're not really getting down. Nobody wants to talk about pedophilia. We don't want to talk about why sexual assault is something that happens in certain communities, but so it's these taboo issues that we don't want to talk about, and that they're there. And so I guess my point is that when we decriminalize something like drugs, that's so taboo. And a lot of the time when I have women who have been assaulted by their partners, it's usually under intoxication, right? It's the majority of the time. So that to say, I really do hope that maybe this is a small step forward with, finally, even though people have been saying it for years, that we need to decriminalize possession. I don't think that's going to make a big difference, but maybe that might change the consciousness in people and start thinking about people who use drugs not as criminals, as human beings, and that might be suffering. Maybe that will change. Will be more a response of compassion instead of judgment. That's my hope. So I guess that's pretty much sums up this workshop. I would love to hear any kind of questions or feedbacks. And again, I don't have the solutions, to be honest with you. And I do think that harm reduction needs to decolonize themselves, because it's very, very, very seldom when I worked at a needles exchange or a safe that we would see Black and Indigenous people coming in. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on many levels. But what I would say is that if you or someone in your life is struggling with drugs, just being present for them and just listening to them is really powerful. And you don't have to have the solutions, right? There's sometimes things people are going through and they don't even know why they're using. Trauma, it doesn't come back as a memory, it comes back as a reaction. And so these are sometimes very, very complicated issues. And that alone can really, really maybe sometimes help somebody to try to find their own path. So harm reduction, I do truly believe that when people have solutions within themselves, and if you support them and let them talk about it and they feel safe, they will find a way. And I really don't believe that people are doomed to it. They do find a way. It's just being able to give them that opportunity and space. Any questions? Does anyone have any questions, comments? Yes.
You know anything about Portugal that decriminalized drugs a few years ago?
Yeah, so that's true. Portugal decriminalized their drugs in 2002, And so what they did was they had a really, like kind of like what we're going through now, overdose crisis. There's a lot of people dying, and they had was very, very interesting. They decided to start taking mobile clinics to communities, like on the street, and offering them things like Suboxone and methadone, and so for making it very easy and accessible. Like that's one of the things is always not. It's very inaccessible to get treatment. And they stopped and then they stopped criminalization. People didn't go to prison anymore. They do, however, still prosecute people who sell drugs. So it's better. It's like it has shown that the crime went down, but significantly. Overdoses, like there was no more overdoses. They really invested in healthcare and mental health, and so it's like we know these things work. But again, like I think that we need to sometimes get out of the model, the medical model. We were very, very fixated on addiction and medical model, which doesn't work for everybody. You know, it really doesn't. So I think we could do better in Portugal. Yes.
I have a question about more of like the media reporting on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and because often it just gets reported as numbers, but they never really report what you're saying, like the underlying patterns and the ways that it impacts the community directly. It's very much more reported as a statistic.
Right.
And so do you have any comment on how media and people can improve in telling these stories in a way that allow us to...
Well, media has like a lot of blood on their hands in reporting MMIWG2S. Like if you know about Tina Fontaine, if people don't know, Tina Fontaine was a 14-year-old young Cree girl who was murdered, who was from Saguenay, right outside north of Winnipeg, and so she was murdered, and it was so sad. And I'm going to talk about this, and I'm, because I think it's really important. The report came out, Tina Fontaine, what happened 24 hours before her death. So Tina, unfortunately, her father was murdered the year before. She developed a lot of substance use problems. Started doing like juvenile prostitution in Winnipeg. She was removed from her family, and in Winnipeg, 80% of Indigenous children are First Nations. So they have no space. So they put teenagers in hotels. So that's what Tina was staying in a hotel. That day, she was actually had two interventions. One was police. She was with a client, an older man. Police had stopped him because he had something with his tail light. So they saw him. They saw her, right? They asked her for her ID. She gave him her ID. She was there was actually a runaway report. The police didn't do anything. Later on that day, she was on the street, completely intoxicated. An ambulance came, and they found high levels of cocaine and alcohol. They brought her to the hospital. They gave her some fluids. They called the social worker that was in her case. They brought her to the hotel and just left her. That night, she was found murdered with her. It's just really, I'm not going to give the details, but she was murdered. And then at her trial, but by the way, her alleged murderer didn't get guilty, right? Because it wasn't the media continuously referred to her as someone who did prostitution and used drugs. That was continuously. So it's how we value certain people, right? Why does that even matter? Why even report that? And that continued. This is up until recently, right? This is like not like if you look at like situations like okay, so I know maybe people you know the Paul Bernardo case. Okay, so Paul Bernardo murdered a serial killer in the 90s with his partner, 4 women. I think it was 4 women. At the same time, there was Richard Crawford in Saskatchewan who did the same thing. He was a serial killer. We never heard. Do you know who Richard Crawford is? No. So then there was Picton, Robert Picton in Vancouver, who was going to downtown East Side, and 40% of his victims were Indigenous women. For 7 years, Indigenous women knew that he was doing that. There was one woman who got picked up by him, and she ran away and went to the police, and they did nothing. So it's like also the media, the way they report it, the way they value certain people's lives, because I don't know. I don't think if we had white girls going missing and murdered, that this would still be going on, right? I really think that everybody would be outraged. And I don't really hear outrage when it comes to the majority of people, because it's kind of like those are other girls. And, I also work with a lot of girls who are in care a lot of them do run away from the system, right? And so we need to also question, like when we call it talking about defunding police, we need to defund and freaking dismantle the child welfare care system. We need to seriously look at what we're doing, because it's really, really, really problematic. And it's like we're kind of just setting up girls to end up on the street. I literally have social workers when they turn 18 calling us saying we'll drop her off at a drop-in center, and I'm like, this isn't the place you want to drop someone off, right? And the statistics of those girls going to prison, or the statistics of them being in intimate partner relationships. Like a lot of the women that are now in prison, a lot of them are for killing their partners, right? And so it's really like when we talk about defunding the police, of course, like we want to abolish the system. We need to abolish it. It's not just, it goes so beyond that. The police, the prosecutors, the prison system. It's so just funneling money, creating wealth for certain communities on the backs of like Indigenous and Black people. That's really what it is, and it's just colonizing being repeated over and over and over again. Yes.
Bringing it back locally to Montreal, you said that you've worked with the police.
Yes.
Can you just give us your take on the SPVM relations with Indigenous people, the good, the bad, the ugly?
Okay, so we have an Indigenous liaison officer. So this is what we were able to do was that I could do missing persons report, and before when there was a missing person, they would categorize this as 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 would be a child, let's say someone was suicidal. But let's say you're a homeless person on the street, it's number 4 priority. So we were able to bump it up always at 1 when it's an Indigenous person. And I would say for men too, because we don't talk about Indigenous men going missing and being murdered, which is very much tied to the drug trade. It's different, but we have a huge problem with Indigenous men going missing and being murdered. And so, I mean, police, they just give me access to, they have the technology, right? Like I had a case where I had a woman who, she was kidnapped. Well, there was a man, he would go Cabot Square, and I can talk about it because the case is over. He would give alcohol to her and bring him back to his place, and then violently assault them and keep them in his apartment for 30 days. She had escaped there, and then I found out about it, and so I went to the police. So the way it works for the police, you go first to the local police station, and then they take the report, and then you have to wait for it to go to major crimes, right? So, and that sometimes can take months. That's the messed up thing. We were able to bump it up to like 2 weeks that when I have a case. So in the meantime, because we were waiting for the detective to come and question her and bring her to major crimes, she went missing again. So I was like, fuck, man. So I called the detective, okay? And I was like, I'm like, we have an address, because she remembered where she was. Can we please go there? And they didn't want to go there because they didn't have a warrant. So I was like, y'all like do all kinds of shady stuff all the time. Now I need you to go to the police. So sure enough, put pressure with this detective, and I'll give her credit. She really did. She really did come through. Like, so we went right away. We went with the patrol car, and we got to the house. The police went in and knocked at the door. The guy opened the door. They asked for so-and-so, she was there. He said no, and then she ran out naked. Okay, so we were able to get her, and then we brought her straight to major crimes because she didn't want to go to major crimes. But with the support of it, I was like, look, we need to gather evidence. We need to like do all of everything. She had like 4 hours of testimony in major crimes that they had to videotape. It took us 3 years to get to trial by jury, and he didn't have any priors before. But he was well known among women on the street, and he had been doing this with other women, because but none of the women wanted to come forward. She was the only one that was able, very, 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 very brave and courageous woman, came forward, and he got 5 years. Okay, and that's like really was one of like, because there was, and it was very traumatic for her. She had to talk about her criminal past, her sex work, her addiction, everything came back up. So we re-traumatize victims in the justice system. I understand why women don't press charges a lot of the time. Can be incredibly difficult. So the SPVM. I don't know if this answers your question. It's not the individual police officers, right? I mean, like I know everybody's like fuck the police. They're just people, right? Like some of them think they're doing well, they're doing a good job. And I have worked with police officers who actually do have compassion, and I've worked with a lot of police officers who don't give a fuck. But at the end of the day, they don't really have any political, they're not really very political. They don't really, they're kind of like, they just want to, they'll take direction and so forth. They're bored. They don't have a lot of work to do, right? They're like completely bored. They're just like patrolling around. So that's why they sometimes like want to, you know, abuse people, right? And the thing with the police that they have is they have the technology. Like they could, I had another case where we could get the cell phone, right? She was missing. I had a 15-year-old was missing, and we had her cell phone, and we were able to track it to where she was. They can get all the records really quickly. So sometimes when families think that someone's missing, I can access, I tell them to access so that we can know if they're in detention. So that really relieves them. Okay, they were arrested, they're not missing. So that's really when we say, like when people say we need the police, they just want okay, what am I supposed to do when I have someone, my neighbor is screaming their head off? Like, call 911, but there's like, what else are you supposed to do? We need something else, right? So it's to replace it. I do intervention for 20 years with people with mental health illnesses, and I've never harmed anybody. You know, and I've done many interventions when people are suicidal with police, and I see how they have their gun ready. And I've said, like, you don't need to be afraid. I know this person, especially if it's a Black or Indigenous man. They are very scared. Like, I remember one time I was doing an intervention, and I knew this man very, very well, and he said he was going to kill himself, so I had to call 911. Ethically, I can't just like not call 911. I went with the so when you call about suicide, I always say I want an ambulance, but they always send the police, right? So that's another problem. Why we're sending police for overdoses and mental health is we shouldn't be sending police, right? They need you know, medical care, right? And when we got there, they were so afraid, they didn't want to let me in. And then when he saw the police, he started freaking out. It was like so stressful because I saw the fear in the police's eyes, right? They were just like, they saw fear because in this case it was a Black man, and they were so afraid of him. And I just kept saying, he's not going to hurt you. He wants to hurt himself. And please let me in for 5 minutes to talk to him. I will get him out, and we'll go in the ambulance, and you won't have to like detain him. And then we need to talk about the medical system, like mental health care system. When we get to the psychiatry, when we get people with mental health, we completely trauma. We create another trauma, right? Like I can't even promise people that they're not going to be apprehended or locked in a room, right? So we criminalize people with mental health problems. So we need to go beyond defunding just the police. Now I'm like thinking we need to defund hospitals too. We need to find alternatives to dealing with these complex issues of society. And it's not just like locking up people, stigmatizing them, and just, you know, taking away their rights and not coming with compassion. So yeah, there's bad, like everywhere else, there's bad, really bad cops. I'm not gonna say there's good cops, but there's cops that just like want their paycheck, right? So they're just trying, and I think that sometimes maybe like in some communities, like, you know, being police, like in Ganawage, the peacekeepers, like they don't ever have violence, right? They're a model, like they carry a weapon, but because it's like someone's cousin, you know, like if they do something, everyone knows each other, right? So they don't have the same kind of issues. So we know that like those kind of, it needs to be by communities for communities. And you just need to fund them, and then communities can come up with their own solutions. They don't need to have external police or support. You know, like if you look at like tragically the James Smith Cree Nation tragedy this week, like it just so proves that he had a warrant out for his arrest. He was known to be violent when he used drugs and alcohol. Nothing was done, right? This totally could have been prevented, right? And so I don't really understand why people sometimes think that by increasing police that we're going to get anywhere, because it just actually makes the situation worse.